Okay, welcome to Many Disciplinaries, Many Disciplines, One Topic. I'll be using the word disciplinary several times in this presentation, so that's why I've already stumbled over my own words. CivicLEADS and the potential for multidisciplinary research data archiving. My name is David Bleckley, and I am a member of ICPSR's Education and Childcare Archives, and I also help to manage the project known as CivicLEADS. And CivicLEADS is civic learning, engagement, and action data sharing. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that in this presentation. As a little bit of an introduction and overview of what we'll be talking about today, I'll give you some background information about CivicLEADS and how we got here, what kind of data we have, and that kind of thing. And then we'll talk about some examples of multidisciplinary research, and then we'll have a brief discussion at the end and move forward towards the potential of this idea in the future. So as a background, CivicLEADS kind of comes out of the same ideas as the Spencer Foundation's New Civics Initiative, and we are indeed funded by a grant by the Spencer Foundation. For those of you who are new to the civic education arena, the New Civics is this idea that civic education extends beyond the traditional textbook, government class kind of style of education that we, many of us are familiar with, and it extends into the community. So how are students engaging with their community? How does civic engagement and civic education blend together? How do they relate to each other? How are students impacting their communities? How do they see their roles in communities? All of those kind of things, and the relationship between action and education. So the other thing to think about with New Civics is that it's studied from a lot of different perspectives in a lot of different disciplines. So we see New Civics research coming out of the field of education, but we also see it coming out of political science, sociology, economics, communication, and a wide variety beyond that list. We also see the greater topic of New Civics being studied from a lot of different subtopical areas. So we'll see research coming about civics and social media, or the way in which students interact with data. So media awareness and media literacy, critical consciousness, and how do students see themselves within their world, and how do they interpret information. And then also typical things like tracking students into the future and seeing how they might vote, or how do they interact with the community as adults. So lots of different ways of looking at this sort of condensed idea of civics or New Civics. And so we're bringing these ideas, these multidisciplinary research data sets, into a centralized location. That was really important to researchers in the field because it's being addressed from so many different disciplines. It's sometimes hard to find data, good quality data about civics education and engagement. So we wanted to create a centralized repository, and that is what CivicLEADS became. And so you can find us on the web at civicleads.org, and don't be surprised when that just redirects you to our webpage on the ICPSR website. So we are part of ICPSR, and we are part of the ICPSR website, but it's a lot easier to tell people to come to civicleads.org. So that's why we have that redirect. And the data sets that you'll find when you get there, well, first of all, what tools do we have on civicleads.org? Because we're part of ICPSR, we have a lot of the same really rich tools that users are used to at ICPSR. So we have ways to search for publications, data sets, and variables, and also you can see how the publications and variables and data sets relate to each other. That's all part of CivicLEADS. And then the data sets you'll find when you come in and search for data, those are a combination of two different, well, coming from two different sources. The first is enhanced studies. So these are studies that have existed at ICPSR for some time that we've gone back in and added some sort of value. So some of them we added some rich metadata to the variables, like new question text. For other ones, we've updated data sets and released new versions of the data so that users can utilize various statistical software packages in their analyses of those data. So those are the enhanced studies. We currently, or by the time we've finished enhancing those studies, we'll have 6 of those available for users, and that enhancement will be wrapping up very shortly. And then we do not have any new studies yet because this is a very new project. However, we will be releasing 2 new studies within the next week or so. And then we anticipate a few more by the end of the year. So be on the lookout for new studies, and at the end of this presentation we'll give you our contact information, and please go to our website, sign up for our mailing list so that you can be updated about those new studies as they're released. We're really excited about a lot of these really high quality, rich studies that are going to be coming out in the near future. So as we thought about this presentation, we wanted to give the audience for the data fair something different than just an introduction to our website. Part of that is because a lot of you folks are already really familiar with the ICPSR website, and since ours is based on the ICPSR framework, there's not really a need to introduce you to our website. But one of the things we're really proud of is the multidisciplinary nature of the research that our data are drawn from. So we wanted to really focus on that, and we wanted to do this in a in a visual way that really lends itself to the webinar format. And so we decided to examine the disciplines that the PIs are coming from, the PIs who have provided us with their research data, and then also looking at the disciplines of the authors who have analyzed these data sets and then went on to publish about their research. And so kind of looking at those two different disciplines, or those disciplines from those two separate sets of researchers, and comparing them. And then again, we wanted to do some data visualizations to really present this in a new and interesting way. So this isn't a really rigorous scientific analysis by any means. We're not running any statistics on these, and we're not going to really present you with a heck of a lot of numbers. But I thought it would still be a good idea to show you some of the methods that we're using, just so you can get an idea of what you're about to see. So thinking back a moment ago, I mentioned that we have these enhanced studies in the CivicLEADS collection, and we have 6 of those. So we selected those 6 enhanced studies to analyze, and those allow us to look at the data that have already been deposited at ICPSR and then have been analyzed by other researchers and published, so that we can really get an understanding of who provided us with these data and who's utilizing these for their own research. There's some good longevity of those data sets in the collection, so that it provides us with a really solid sample to work with. And then we took those 6 studies, we identified who are the PIs, and then determined what their disciplines were. Then we looked at the authors of the related publications and identified what their disciplines are. Just as a point of clarification, we deduplicated the authors. So a lot of times an author will download a data set and get 3, 4, 5 publications out of it, which is great. They're really mining the depths of these data. But for the purposes of this presentation, they are only counted once, regardless of if they published once or a half dozen times. So then after compiling all of those different data, we created these data visualizations to share with you so you can really see the different disciplines that folks are coming from. Okay, so to jump into the data, our first data set that we'll be looking at is the study of political socialization. And this is it's a parent-child pair study so that researchers can take a look at the political ideas of parents and children, and what are the relationships between those. Are children learning their political ideas based on their parents' political ideas? Are they pushing back and going to the opposite pole? So that's just some of the data that are inside this study. And as you can see, the two PIs of this study are both political scientists. So in our data visualization, we have two little circles, and those are our two political scientists that are the PIs of this study. And then as we look at the folks who have done secondary analysis and published based on this, we, again, have political scientists. So we have not only our two PIs included in this sample, but we also have 6 more political scientists. So in this situation, we have political scientists analyzing data created by political scientists, so not super multidisciplinary for this study. So let's move on to the next one and see what that one looks like. So for the next one, this is the Commission on Youth Voting and Civic Knowledge Youth Post-Election Survey, which is a mouthful. The civics education research community often refer to this as the CIRCLE study. This it was released by an organization called CIRCLE, and their PI is in the realm of public policy, affairs, and administration. So for the purposes of these analyses, we lumped public policy, public affairs, and public administration together. So there is that PI, a little green dot. And looking at the publications created out of the secondary analysis of this, we have that PI, again, that public policy affairs admin PI, but then we have 2 researchers from the field of communication. We have someone from psychology and human development, and then we have 3 researchers from education. So sort of in contrast to the SPS study that we saw previously, we've got quite a wide variety. In fact, there's nobody from the PI's own discipline that has published about this, except for the PI himself. So our third study is drawn from the Census Bureau's current population survey, civic engagement supplement. And we decided to give the super scientific classification of other to the Census Bureau because the Census Bureau is not entirely economics, it's not entirely sociology. There are lots of different facets of how you think about the census, and so we just decided to call it other. So when we look at the publications, however, we have folks coming from economics, political science, social work, sociology, public policy affairs and administration, psychology and human development, and then also 6 others. And in this case, the others don't include the Census Bureau because we don't have a related publication on our website from the Census Bureau. So these 6 others are from a variety of different fields, including women's health, public health and health policy, as well as public relations. So again, we've got really multidisciplinary ways of analyzing this one data set. The next study is another one of these sort of flagship studies in the realm of civic education. This is the IEA Civic Education Study from 1999. It's often called CivicLEADS in the research community. And this is a study that pulls data from 28 different countries around the world, including the United States, mostly in Europe, but then also Hong Kong and Australia. So this is a really, and also 2 from Latin America. So this is a really interesting data set because it utilized the same questions across 28 different countries, and that is really wonderful for doing comparative analyses. The 2 folks that led the way for the release of these data are a political scientist and a researcher in psychology and human development. And then if we look at the publications coming out of the CivicLEADS study, you can see it's the vast majority are coming out of education, and we also have folks from psychology and human development, public policy affairs and administration, some sociologists, some political scientists, and 1 other. And in this case, I believe the other is a statistician. So it's what's kind of interesting about this slide is that even though the PIs are from psychology and human development and political science, a third discipline is the dominant discipline for the publication. So education researchers are really tapping into this data set. The other thing that is interesting to point out about this one is that the 2 PIs are from 2 different disciplines themselves. So the study itself is a multidisciplinary study beyond just being studied from a lot of different perspectives in terms of secondary analysis. So the next study is very related to that last study. So this is the United States portion of the CivicLEADS study, and what's different about this is that it was released by ICPSR earlier, and the data from this are not just the student data. So the previous slide showed these 28 countries data just for the student data. The United States data that we have available at CivicLEADS is it's the student data, but also teacher data and school level data. So there's a little bit more depth for researchers who want to focus on the United States, but then for those who are more interested in the international perspective, the other IEA CivicLEADS study is probably more up their alley. So these data were released from the United States perspective by education researchers. So that's why this differs from the international study. Might be a little bit confusing, but it's all based on who is the PI from the ICPSR point of view. And then again, we have a different distribution of publications from the United States CivicLEADS study than we did for the international study. There is some overlap of authors here, but we can see that there's still a lot of education researchers, as well as psychology and human development, 1 person from public policy affairs and administration, 1 sociologist, 3 political scientists, an economist, and 2 others. In this case, the 2 others, I believe, are a statistician and a philosophy researcher. And our final study for our 6 studies is the United States Citizenship Involvement Democracy Survey, or CID. And again, one of the neat things about this one is it's a multidisciplinary team producing the data. So we have 2 political scientists and 1 researcher in the area of public policy affairs and administration. And these 3 PIs work together to release this data set. And then the publications derived from that data set are perhaps the most diverse out of all of the publications that we've looked at. So we've got a lot of different disciplines represented here, as well as a fair number of researchers in each of those disciplines. So we have communication, political science, sociology, public policy affairs and administration, psychology and human development, one economist, 3 education researchers, and again, other. And in this case, the other, I believe, is from business and philanthropic studies, and one more that slips my mind at the moment. So let's bring them all together, because we're talking about multidisciplinary research as this entire topic area of civic education, civic engagement, and civic action. So let's bring them all together and think about this from more of a macro level. And what we have, again, we've got this, and these are drawn from 6 different studies. So we have 6 studies and 10 different PIs from 5 different disciplines. So that's pretty interesting. We have 6 studies exploring different aspects of civic education and civic engagement, and they're coming from five different disciplines. And I think that's kind of noteworthy, because we didn't anticipate that we would have this kind of diversity, but it kind of makes sense given that we know how multidisciplinary this field is. So again, here are the PIs from these 6 studies, and then the next slide we'll look at the publications. And again, you can see a really broad distribution of disciplines from across the board. We have the largest number from education, but we also have large numbers of political scientists and psychology and human development researchers, as well as public policy affairs and administration, sociology, economics, communication, social work, and other. Moving on to the overall discussion of what our findings were from this little analysis. We can see again that we have 10 different PIs from 5 different disciplines, and these publications came from 205 authors from 8 main disciplines, plus another 7 other disciplines. And as a refresher, some of those others are public relations, philanthropic studies, public health, women's health, philosophy, and statistics. All of the studies from the 6 we looked at, except for 1, had publications outside of the discipline of that PI. And so that's really interesting, because we're really trying to think about this as a multidisciplinary field, but that's not to say that political scientists use one data set and that's the only data set they use, and education researchers use another data set and that's the only data set that they use, but they're still studying civic education. We have real evidence that researchers are using data from outside of their field to explore civic education from their own perspective. So if a data set is collected by an education researcher, that a secondary analyst could come from political science or sociology or communication and utilize that data set in a completely different way and provide a really interesting perspective. Another interesting finding that I didn't make a bullet point on the slide, but we have two out of the 6 data sets with multidisciplinary PI teams. So PIs are seeking out partnerships from outside of their departments, outside of their disciplines, to gather data and to explore these topics together, which really shows that civics education researchers kind of value that interdisciplinary research. And so let's talk about the potential for this. I think that this is really promising as we look ahead to our future data deposits. We've got, as I said, we've got 2 data sets that are about to be released in the next week or 2. And when we think about what our hopes are for these, we really hope that researchers will, from a lot of different disciplines, will come in and look at these data in new ways. That's one of the reasons for sharing data, is to bring in new perspectives, to think about data in different ways, and then hopefully to collaborate as well. I really think that the interdisciplinary research that goes on has a lot of promise too, and so hopefully CivicLEADS can be a catalyst for that kind of collaboration and that interaction across disciplines. You know, we strive to do that, you know, actively, but I think that passively, that CivicLEADS will also allow for some of that collaboration, because we'll have data from a lot of different disciplines all about the topic of civic education and engagement and involvement, and really allow folks to come in from all over to slice and dice the data and to think about them from a wide variety of disciplinary perspectives. So I'm very hopeful that CivicLEADS will be a great centralized repository for multidisciplinary research around civic education and action. And I hope that any of you who are out there that are either helping researchers to find data about civic education, or who are researchers yourselves and interested in analyzing these data, I hope that you'll come to CivicLEADS and really access the data and utilize them in new and interesting ways. So with that, I think that we will go to your questions. Hopefully we've had a few stumpers from the crowd, but we really welcome any questions about CivicLEADS, about the data you can find with us, and you know, maybe just the data we presented today. So fair game.
Okay, so while we're waiting for questions to come in, I just wanted to make a plug for our final 2 Data Fair 2016 webinars. The next one, which I think is going to be well attended, is Cultural Participation of U.S. Adults, featured NADAC Data Highlights. NADAC is our National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture. And then the final webinar for the day is Understanding the Data and Access Options Available in NADAC, and that's our HIV and Addiction archive, featuring the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health, PATH study. Okay, so at the moment, I'm going to give people a little while longer to ask questions. Okay, well, it appears that you don't have any questions. You will see this video probably by, oh, we do have one question. So I was going to say you'll see the video on YouTube. Okay, let's answer this question. There's a slight lag, I think. Here's one that says, does CivicLEADS work across the U.S.?
So we are trying to draw data from across the U.S. and across the world, if possible. You know, we really are trying to get the best data possible for our users, and a lot of times that means trying to find nationally representative samples within the data. We aren't restricting our data to national samples by any means. We're in fact going to be releasing a couple of data sets in the near future that are not nationally representative. So the answer is we are trying to find national level data sets, but we are also going to be releasing regional data sets or state level data sets from across the United States. So yes, we do not have any restrictions about, we're not focusing on Michigan, for instance, but we will be bringing in data from across the United States and hopefully across the world, and releasing those to our users.
The next question is, can you tell us more about the 2 data sets you will be releasing soon?
Sure. I'm happy to do that. The first data set is the Youth Participatory Politics Survey, which is a survey that the PIs are Joe Kahn and Kathy Cohen, and it's a study of it's looking at the participation in the political process of students, and it is, let's see, there are 3 waves of this data set. We'll be releasing the first wave here shortly, and then as the other waves are made available to us by the PIs, we'll be releasing those. The second data set that we'll be releasing soon is the Critical Consciousness Development study, and that is from Matthew Deemer, who set out to study, is there a way to talk with at-risk students about their critical consciousness? How aware are they about the world around them, and how does that world impact them? How do they impact their world? Really focusing on various realms of critical consciousness. And so he set about finding a way to survey students about critical consciousness, and then he went and validated that survey. So he started with, I believe it was 40-something, 42 or 48 items in that survey, and then he whittled it down to a much more workable survey, and so his original data set that he used to validate those survey items is what we'll be releasing, so that other researchers can replicate his work or do further secondary analysis on that. So look for both of those in the next couple of weeks.
Will all of these data sets be downloadable?
So the short answer is we strive to make sure that all of our data will be publicly available and downloadable. So all of the data should be available for download, and it should also have an online data analysis version available to users. Because we don't know what data we'll be getting from emerging scholars, or the data that are still out there in the field, we are open to having restricted use data, because a lot of times you can get really rich data that require a little bit more rigorous data use agreements between CivicLEADS and the data users. So we are open to having restricted use data, but even in those situations, we'll really strive to have a public use version, because we really value getting the data out into the hands of as many researchers as possible. So yes, if you come to CivicLEADS.org today, you can download data. I guarantee it.
And on that note, which is a great way to end, just want to say thanks for attending this webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, and please do be in touch. Come to CivicLEADS.org, check out our data, download our data, and sign up for our mailing list so that you can learn about the release of future data. And also feel free to email me. My name is David, and you can email me at civicleads@umich.edu. Thank you.